All right, in our last video, you learned how to make a basic procedural material, and now we're going to sort of expand our repertoire of the different types of materials that you can create by learning a little bit more about the different types of nodes in Blender's shading system. So I just have a blank project. I'm going up here to the shading tab, and we're going to make some materials. And I'm just going to go into rendered view mode, and in top view, I'm just going to drag this light over so we can sort of see what we're doing. So this is just a default cube. It's got the blank material on it. And let's take a look at some of the different types of texture nodes that we've got. So I'm going to add the ones that I think are the most common and the ones that you're going to use the most if you're going to be doing a lot of procedural texture generation. So I'm going to hit Shift A, Texture, and Voronoi Texture. So let's look at this one first. So I'm just going to plug the color into the base color output so you can sort of see what we've got. So this is sort of, it's a little bit like sort of a noise texture, but it's a little bit different than the other noise texture that we used in the previous video. This one has a color output here as well. You can see that we've got that, and then we've also got a distance, which is just a black and white output. Now, if we turn the randomness all the way down, you can see essentially what this is outputting is like a grid of these, let's plug the color back in, this sort of grid of random colored squares, or from the distance node, this sort of grid of these sort of radial patterns. And essentially by adding randomness to this pattern, we get something that looks a little bit more like this. And that's pretty cool because, this sort of can be used to represent a lot of real world textures. There are a lot of ways that we can use something like this. For example, if you wanted to make a polka dot material, you could turn the randomness all the way down to 0 and then add a color ramp node, which we haven't used yet. And essentially what you can sort of think about a color ramp as being is it sort of takes in this input here, right, which is a factor, which is the, in this case, we're plugging the Voronoi texture into it. And then it takes that 0 to 1 input and reevaluates the values based on this bar of colors up here. So in this case, we have 0 to 1, which is going from black to white, which is how the factor input will work by default because it's a 0 to 1. This input is a 0 to 1 channel value. But then if we wanted to, we could change it from that to something else. So for example, we could make it go from black to blue or black to red. If I click this little handle here, you can see it's got these handles, and I can change it to a different color. And on top of that, I can also change how that range of values is getting converted. So it's 0 to 1, but by dragging these handles, I can say, okay, well, I want more of the high values to be blue and sort of less of the high values to be black. Or we can do the opposite where we make it more black like this and get sort of an inverse where we've got this sort of star pattern here. And on top of that, if you wanted to, you can also add additional handles so that you can have a range of color outputs from the range of values that you're inputting. So for example here, if you can imagine you've got a black and white map, like this Voronoi texture here, you've got black, you've got white, but then you've also got some grays. Well, grays are sort of in the middle of the spectrum. If you can think about this channel output as being 0 to 1, grays are sort of more like 0.5. They're sort of, half black and half white. And so what you could do is you could add another handle here and put a different color sort of around that 0.5 value. So here, if I, and I'm just going to Control-Shift-Click to go back to our principled BSDF, I'm going to add a different color by clicking this plus, and it's going to put another handle here. And so I can change this to say, maybe I want those gray values to be like yellow or something. So now we've got black going into yellow and then into blue. And maybe I'll do something that's a little more contrasty because that seems very hard to see. Do sort of red to green. There we go. And if I want more red, again, I can drag this handle down to bring that out. If I want more black, I could drag this to bring this in. And so now you can see that by mixing different types of color data, essentially, how quickly we can start to create the materials that we're interested in. So I'm going to delete this color ramp and plug the distance back into the base color of our Voronoi, because I also want to show you some of its other settings. So down here it's got F1. You can also change this to a number of different types that have different appearances. So if I go to smooth F1, for example, you can see it got much smoother. And if I plug the color input into the base output, you can see that this essentially is a smooth version where we don't have those hard edges between pieces of the Voronoi anymore. Now we've got sort of a smooth transition between these different colors. And if you turn up the randomness, you can get sort of a much more random looking, but also much smoother sort of color output. And the same thing for this black and white distance. We also have a number of different types. There's F2, which looks like this, and there's also distance to edge, which is useful sometimes if you need to make like a cracked texture or something like that. We can use distance to edge, and with this again, you can adjust the scale and randomness. All right, so now let's look at a different one. So if we go again, I've deleted that. We're going to go Shift A, texture, and we're going to look at the Musgrave texture. So the Musgrave texture only has a height output. It doesn't have a color output. So let's take this height and we're going to plug it into the base color, and you can see this is what our Musgrave texture looks like. And again, it's got some parameters that change the appearance. It's got a dimension, which you can adjust here. It gets a little bit more sort of blurry and more uniform if we turn the dimension up. It's got this lucinarity. I'm not sure if I'm saying that right, but it's not really a scale. If you can see here, let me turn it all the way to 0. You can see like the white and black pattern are sort of staying the same, but the sort of overlaid pattern is what's getting smaller here. We've also got detail, which makes it more or less detailed. And this can be really useful if you can imagine, say for example, you wanted to make like a granite countertop or something, right? So I could turn the roughness all the way down here and add maybe an HDRI to the world so we can actually see the reflection, right? And now you can see we've got this like sort of granite material here. Or you could use this to just drive noise, as sort of the input for a mix node, or there are lots of cool things that you can do with a Musgrave map like this. The next one is brick. I have seen people use the brick a lot of the time for making like paneled floors and stuff like that. If you click this brick texture and we take this color and we plug it into the principled BSDF, you'll see that it outputs this texture where we've got like bricks on the top, and they're sort of in like a brick pattern, like you would see clay bricks on the side of a house. And the factor is the same thing, but inverted and with no color variation between the individual bricks. Not surprisingly, this is useful if you want to make bricks. So you could use this, for example, as the input for the factor to a mix node between, like, I don't even know. I'd have to look at a reference image. I don't know what color bricks are anymore, but maybe something like this. And you can see that you're starting to get already that sort of brick pattern. Or you could also imagine that if you wanted to, on this brick texture here, if I hit Control T to add a mapping node, and then I scale it along, just one axis, and I'm going to hold Shift and click drags, which by the way slows down or reduces the amount that dragging your mouse affects this, so you can get sort of finer control over what you're dragging. And if I reduce this mortar size, to like 0.005, something like that, that you could also use this to make like floorboards. And if you had your own custom wood material that you wanted to use for the boards, so instead of modeling every individual board like we did in the previous video, you could also just use this factor input here. Let me plug this into the base, or actually Control Shift click so we can, let me just plug this factor into the base color so we can get a look at this. You could just use this as the mask and then have, a material in white, that is for like the grout between the bricks, and then everywhere that's in black would be your, or maybe not grout, but like the space between the boards, and then everything in black would be like your wood material. And you would do that by plugging this factor into the factor input on a mix node and plugging your two materials for like the wood and the space into these A and B slots on the mix node. And then there are a couple that we've already seen. So like texture, Shift A texture, wave texture. We used this already when we went to make our wood. And then Shift A texture, environment texture. This again is for environment texture. So that's what we're using here in world to add our HDRI. So this is an environment texture here. We also have a checker texture. So Shift A texture, checker texture, and let's plug that base color into this base color here. And you can see what that looks like. So if you wanted to make a checker flag or a chessboard, or to use this to drive the input of some mixing in a more complex material. Now I think that's all the procedural textures that I wanted to talk about. One other thing I'm going to add quickly at the end here is, if you remember, we added in a previous video a vector bump, and what this does is it takes in a height input, which is a factor input, so any one channel input, which you can tell because this input is gray and not yellow, and it outputs a normal vector, which you can plug into the normal slot here. I also wanted to point out that there's also a vector normal map node, so Shift A vector normal map, and this takes in a color input, and this is where you would plug in, for example, if you had a normal map image texture that you've imported that will have a 3-channel color output instead of a bump map that has a 1-channel output. You would plug that into the input on this color, and that will output this normal vector that goes in here. And again, you can tell this is a vector output because it's sort of bluish purple. All of the color inputs are yellow, which means that they're 3-channel, which means that they have RGB, and then all of the sort of 1-channel inputs are gray. Now I wanted to touch on one last thing, which is groups. So if you've got like a really complex material where you've got like a bunch of nodes, right, it can get a little bit messy to work with. And sometimes if you've created, for example, a base color from like 5 or 6 different nodes, you may just want to output that or to have that represented by a single node so that it's clearer for you in your shader graph. You can do that by grouping nodes. So if you highlight the nodes you want to group, you can hit right click and make group, or you can just hit Control G. So I'm going to highlight these and hit Control G, and you can see it created a group here where we've got our this, and our this that we had grouped, and then they're being output to the group output. And then if you hit Tab while you're in this window, it will take you out of the group. And so now this node group here has all of that stuff inside of it. So we've just got this single color output, and that is the color that's going into our principal BSDF. So that's a really useful tool that can help you to keep your shader graphs much cleaner. And this is especially the case if you're working on complex materials. We might talk about the node group a little bit later on, but for now that's probably enough. All right, so that's it for this video, and we're sort of working up towards having all the tools we need to work on a bigger project. I mentioned at some point we're going to make a photorealistic sword, so I think that will be coming up pretty soon, and we might do some other projects as well.